In this video, the first thing I'm going to do is disappoint you. I was enticed by this title, The Kraken Wakes, to pick up this book and read it, and unfortunately there aren't any Krakens in The Kraken Wakes. However, the best fantasy is not about the monsters. The monsters are just a framework for exploring different themes and questions about humanity, usually, I think. And so what this book really deals with is the human response to the threat of its own demise. I know some of you are going to think less of me because look at the state of the book. Wasn't all me though, because I do read a lot of secondhand books. But look, do you like dog ears? It's not been particularly easy for me to upload a video recently, you may have noticed, or even to get reading done. Just been busy with life. But I have clawed and chewed my way back on here, and this time with a 1953 sci-fi novel about extraterrestrial-induced planetary disaster. The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham was first published in 1953 in Britain, and then when it was published in the US, it was published initially under a different name, Out of the Deeps, which is, there's less of an issue of false advertising. John Wyndham also wrote short stories and detective novels, but he's best known for his sci-fi. And he wrote a modified form of sci-fi, which he labeled logical fantasy. And it's pretty clear when you read the book that he did thorough research into different fields, including oceanography and applications for atomic fission. You may have heard of his other novels, Midwich Cuckoos and also The Day of the Triffids. And they were both made into movies. I think the Midwich Cuckoo was made into movies 3 times and twice under the name The Village of the Damned. Just because it's set in the 1950s and there's a horror element to the book, if you like 1950s American horror movies or the pulp fiction from that era, you might like John Wyndham's The Kraken Wakes. But I would say that it isn't as sensational as those. And it isn't as it's grander, it's more all-encompassing, because it's not about a monster chasing screaming people, although I won't say anything. It's more so about it's global catastrophe, it's environmental catastrophe with witticisms. To give you a taster of what The Kraken Wakes is about, it begins with a brief section called Rationale, in which the narrator and his wife are discussing writing a record about their experiences as they sit watching icebergs floating by. And so it gives you a sense of what is to come, and also then that this story is told in retrospect. And then we have Lord Alfred Tennyson's poem The Kraken, which strikes a note that reverberates throughout the story later on. And then the bulk of the book is segmented by phases. So you've got phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And that kind of also, for me, added an element of mystique. Like these are not parts, they're phases. Why is that? It's told from the viewpoint of a journalist who works for the EBC, which is the lesser known competitor of the BBC. And it's the source of recurring misunderstandings in the book, where they have to explain that the EBC is not the BBC. So it was in its inchoate stages. The protagonist is referred to as Watson. Watson and his wife, Phyllis, they're kind of both somewhat equal protagonists, but the story is really told is written by Watson. And his wife's kind of a collaborator, and that's true for their work in general throughout the book. They happen to be honeymooning aboard a boat on the Atlantic, and they're amongst the first witnesses of these unidentified flying objects, red, fuzzy, and variously shaped objects that are seen coming from the sky and plummeting into the ocean. So Phyllis and Watson are a husband and wife journalist duo which is very important because they're implicated in how and what information the public receives, because the press is like a moderating kind of controlling agent that preserves the international relations and public order and the stability of the markets. So they're closely watched from that perspective. They're closely monitored and instructed as to what to do. Also for the best interests of the commercial body which they work for. Various interests are influencing the narrative that the public receives, and this has a serious bearing on the response of humanity to all the events that proceed. So after that, those initial sightings, there are more and more sightings of these UFOs, you could call them, entering the sea around the world. And at first, the media are reticent to release much because they deem it too similar to like flying saucers, and they think that's not novel enough for their audience. But gradually, the sightings start to make the news. So all of this is happening against the backdrop of the Cold War, and naturally tensions begin to flare, especially between Russia and the rest of the world. And at the beginning, Russia maintains a calculated silence because inscrutability must mask hidden power. But then countries start to shoot down the objects, and Russia responds with like, how dare you attribute your own crimes to us? They start proclaiming proudly that the capitalistic fireballs that dared cross into the only democratic airspace in the world have been duly shot down. So this ingrained mutual suspicion between nations delays the increasingly obvious conclusion that the threats are, or the objects, let's say, they aren't obviously threatening anybody at that stage, are of an extraterrestrial origin. So militaries are the first to recognize the threats as extraterrestrial and to take a proactive approach to investigating what they are. And our two protagonists are invited to attend the descent of a bathoscope, which is like a high-tech submersible for the time. They investigate areas in the ocean that are particularly deep because there's a concentration of these objects, or all of them seem to be entering the ocean where the depth is very great. The descent is supposed to be a slow and boring affair that's from the protagonist's perspective, and they take lots of cigarette breaks when it's happening. And I think this is a bit of a Wyndhamian tactic to lull the reader into a false sense of security and then to build tension slowly out of that. And a bit Hitchcockian, but maybe not as masterful as Hitchcock. So there are two crew members aboard the submersible, and once it gets down to its maximum depth of about 1,200 fathoms, they notice something outside of the submersible, but down there with the darkness and the murkiness, they're not really able to discern. They have a camera, so they're able to relay up that information to the ship, but they're not able to discern what it is, and it circles the ship, and they start spinning, and then at this point the ship is pulling them up, and the winch starts to accelerate outside, and after the signal is cut off, and because it's unburdened of the weight of the submersible, and then they pull it up, and they expect to see that already the crew members are lost, they're done for, but they expect to see that it's been pulled apart, or the force of it, the cable has given way to the weight of the submersible or something like that. But in fact, when the wire is pulled up, it's a fused blob of metal instead. So after that, they lower an uncrewed observation instrument, and the same thing happens again. The cable is apparently melted. So soon after that, ships start disappearing on the oceans, and with sometimes no trace of them at all. And the media does its best to brush over these events and sort of explain them away for fear of like harm to the shipping industry. But there's only so much that metal fatigue can do to explain away these things. It becomes a bit of a running joke. And I'm going to stop there because I want to avoid spoiling the story for you, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a taste of what this story is like. The Kraken Wakes has been described as a cozy catastrophe novel, which I think was meant as a dig, and also isn't without grounds, because there's a certain Britishness to the Kraken Wakes. It's all very calm and keep calm and carry on, until quite late in the game anyway. And people are generally able to keep their panic at bay and maintain decorum, and that's very much what the media is all about, is like maintaining that the calmness, that preservation of normality. While the characters maintain their stiff upper lips, the book's not without its shift in atmosphere, and I think it's pretty slow-paced book. It's safe to say, even though it's not terribly big. I'm okay with that because I think if the topic's interesting, I don't mind dwelling on it. I'm a kind of I'm a slow-paced woman, and I like to see things from different angles or whatever, so I don't mind that. But I think that others who don't usually like a slow-paced book might appreciate it because that slow pace allows for that gradual build of tension to dread. I have to choose my words carefully here. The revelation, it catches you off guard all the more for the fact that, things at the beginning seem to be so civilized on the surface. There's such a sense of normality, that while the characters are trying to solve the mystery of what's going on, that you're so gradually approaching the least preferred conclusion that there's a starker contrast. Another thing to mention about tone is that it never succumbs to hopelessness, and I think that might be a legacy of like post World War II Britain, and there's always something to be done. The characters are always busying themselves with something, whether it's their assigned work or just the work of like pursuing the answer to their questions themselves, or I'm not going to say any more. I have to be very careful to avoid spoilers. So the Kraken Wakes, I would say, is thinking sci-fi. It doesn't just ask, how did these beings, where did they come from? What are they? And how can we battle them? It asks questions like, those are the obvious questions. It asks like, how is it that this insentient artifact can distinguish between the inanimate and animate? David Mitchell described John Wyndham as William Blake with a science doctorate, and I think that doesn't just point to the fact that he does the thorough research in various fields, which lends realism to his work, but also his visionary talent. And several times during the book, I felt a sense of recognition or a sense of the events in the book being relevant to now or our near future. So for me personally, rather than assuming that the modern feeling concern for the ecosphere in the Kraken Wakes is predicated on ideas about climate change, I would say that I don't think that was intentional if we do draw those comparisons, because obviously we're seeing everything through a modern lens when you read an older book. I think the prophetic feeling quality of his story simply reflects the fact that his story abides by physical laws, that the understanding of which hasn't changed in our time. And also, like I think when I'm reading, I kind of expect people who lived in a different time before I was born to be more different than they would have been. And the reality is that like certain characteristics of humanity have been around since before 2024. Like, for example, humans like to hold out for the longest possible time, given the slimmest chances, to keep doing what we're habituated to doing for as long as possible, because God forbid we should ever have to change tact. The choice of profession for the protagonists focuses the mind on the role of communications in the world and the manipulation of the flow of information, and also the fickleness of the public. So everybody has to be concerned with optics. The government is concerned with maintaining their power, and private interests are concerned with the bottom line, and investors are concerned with the stock market. The military is concerned with their prestige, and academics self-censor for fear of damaging their professional careers. It was perhaps a more straightforward task in the 1950s for governments to censor and repackage information than it is now in the digital age. In the Kraken Wakes, the disinformation game is pretty binary, because there's basically the communist narrative and the narrative of the West. And of course, there are variations slightly, like there are different publications and with different readerships, but they're basically putting a slightly different spin on the same information. So people outside of Russia are polarized in their interpretation of Russia's pronouncements. There are two basic camps. There's the one that has unwavering trust in the veracity of whatever Russia puts out, and their life is simple and straightforward. But the other group has a real conundrum, because Russia, they know that Russia is a chaotic source of information. any statement could be a straight out lie, it could be an exaggeration, it could be downplay, or it could be a decoy, Russia deflecting away from more critical information. It could also be the truth, released under the knowledge that a falsehood is expected. In that situation, your powers of deduction can just drown in the possibilities. So when things get polarized, the sophistication of the arguments tends to deteriorate quickly on both sides very often, because polarization is basically the oversimplification of reality, and there's no space for grays. It's like it's like the internet all over again. In the book, the protagonist, commenting on the behavior of the Muscovite, which is presumably Stalin, insinuates that he's succumbing to simplistic reasoning, namely, my enemy's enemy is my friend. That is, that if the sea is inconveniencing and embarrassing the American, it must be acting on and conversant in and acting on good dialectically materialistic principles. I thought that was funny. The age-old bickering between nations quickly leads one thinker to rule out the possibility of harmony between the colonizers and humans, because what does he say? If we can't even tolerate anything but the narrowest differences of views within our own race, how could we tolerate another intelligent species? So the scientist figure explains that life is by definition strife, and intelligence is like the ultimate weapon in the competition for survival, and is therefore like a kind of absolute. And because of that, an intelligent species will be at the top with, wielding the ultimate weapon, and it cannot allow for a rival intelligence. Any two intelligent species are destined in this zero-sum game view of reality to destroy one another, or for one of them to come out on top and destroy the other. John Wyndham seems very cognizant of human mental patterns, and what sort of it awoke me to was the perennial nature of many human thinking patterns, that they haven't changed much since the 1950s. And I was like, oh, so we were having conversations like this before the internet. So human cognitive failings abound in this book. Biases, overreactive imaginations, the failure of the imagination, our tendency to remain under the sway of the passive majority, our failure to act on time. All of these human cognitive frailties play a critical part in how people in the book respond to the threat to their own existence. So everyone is susceptible to these frailties, including scientists. And it's commented on in the book that a pivotal character who kind of represents rational-mindedness has his own cognitive biases, that his own weaknesses. The usual trouble of liberal-minded men is that they think others are too. Bocker has an interested, inquiring mind. He has never grasped that the average mind, when it encounters something new, is scared and says, better smash it or suppress it quick. I don't know about you, but I often make the unfounded assumption that the person I'm talking to thinks more like me than they really do. And I actually don't think it's a liberal-minded problem. I think it's just a human tendency towards being like a bias towards an optimistic view about how much you're connecting with someone. Maybe it's the false consensus effect, or maybe it is like theory of mind not working very well. One of the reasons given for the reluctance to listen to, or even the hostility towards evidence-based theories, which is like this really personified by this Bocker character in the book, is that the theories, in the way that they're put forward, they're indigestible for most people. They just really stick in the throat. And even the self-confessed wide-gulleted protagonist admits that he finds the scientist's theories hard to swallow, and although he can only attribute this to his own resistance. There's also the matter of preserving one's pre-existing view of reality, enter confirmation bias. And there's a minor character in the book who, needing everything to fit into a framework limited by her geopolitical understanding, divines that the scientist character must be a communist spy. You know, that's a digestible nemesis. The same woman, representing a whole section of society, suspects, or it's heavily implied that she suspects, her friend Phyllis, who's one of the protagonists, of being a communist spy. And merely for the fact that Phyllis seems a little bit cynical about that minor character's conspiracy theories. So other conspiracy theories and black and white views of the world flood into the vacuum left by rejected science-based theories. There's a more subtle version of this rejection of a too novel or overwhelming bombshell of a fact, and it's crystallized for us in a National Geographic style piece of writing in the book from one of the publications, and it's sort of the more highbrow, let's say, than the average publication. And it's so dignified and so poetic and lofty that it divorces the reader from the reality and the urgency of the situation. Because alarmism is unseemly. That scientist figure explains that it is necessary to overcome the tendency of the scientific age to so mistrust our senses that we will fall over backwards in order to disregard the abnormal. It seems that in order for a new theory to usurp an older theory, an excess of evidence is needed, even if the original theory is very meagerly supported by the evidence. So this is definitely a problem nowadays. And, you know, lay people who aren't trained in science, but scientists too are susceptible to this, I'd imagine. They are liable, they think of themselves as scientifically minded, and they're liable to let their cynicism override their rationality because they're kind of mistaking cynicism for their rational mindedness. There's a real phenomenon where scientists tend to hold back new findings that conflict with prior findings, lest the public interpret that as meaning that there's no consensus in the scientific community. Another cognitive misfortune that is alluded to multiple times by the protagonist, and which he admits to sharing with his fellow Englishmen, is the muted or non-existent concern for victims of disasters in distant or exotic regions. And what's really meant by that is victims who are not English or are not of European origin, let's say, if you know what I mean. While admitting to sharing this with others, he admits that it's reprehensible, and he doesn't specifically say it's a form of outgroup bias, but that's basically what he's getting at. That was a bit long, wasn't it? As usual, I want to thank you for staying for the entirety of the video, and I was really blindsided by the success, relatively minor success by YouTube standards, of my last video. And that success is ongoing. And, you know, I say minor, but by my standards, it's explosive. And welcome to any new subscribers. And thank you to anybody who contributed to the engaging and stimulating conversation in the comments. I've been learning a lot from you guys. So quick mention about comments. I have been trying to acknowledge everybody's comments and reply to as many as possible. With exceptions, of course, because sometimes it's blatantly clear that somebody's not really looking for a discussion. Not seriously, they're looking for something else, and I might skip over those. But another reason that some comments might have been flying under the radar is disappearing comments. YouTube sent out a notice saying that some of the comments on YouTube Studio and also watch pages have been disappearing, and that might impact your communication with your viewers. So apologies if you've been the author of, you know, legitimate civil comments and I haven't been getting back to you. I am constrained to some extent by my own income generating work and also my private life. So and my mental energy, to be honest. I won't always be able to answer everybody's comments, I suspect, but I will try my best to acknowledge everybody's comments. I'm fully aware that given the success of my last video, compared to every other video that I posted, that you know, a lot of my new subscribers will have a preference for non-fiction related content. So I had been saying in the comment section of that video that I would post something related to immigration soon. That is on its way, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, until then, stay well, stay curious, and stay reading.